Hello and welcome back. My name is Justin Vance, your instructor for the course. I thought it appropriate uh, at this point to take a step back and look at the organization of the U.S. Armed Forces over time. You probably have noticed some of the changing organization during our studies, but this draws it all together in one place. Part, of course, of organizing how your country uh, fights wars is how wars are declared. Of course, the U.S. Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress. Also, Congress, the House of Representatives specifically, um, controls the purse for all things that our government does, the funding of all activities. So, those are two pieces of warfare, obviously, that are very important. And the founding fathers put the most important things into the branch of government closest to the people, which was the Congress and specifically the House of Representatives, right? Which is where we have the most direct and the most ample representation. Of course, there's checks and balances too, so that's probably one reason why the president is the commander in chief. But as we look at these are all the wars that have been declared in American history. There are 11 declared wars in American history. Of course, the American Revolution was before the Constitution, so it's not listed here. But you see the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. Of course, the Civil War is not on here because declaring war would have recognized the Confederacy as a separate country, and we considered it a rebellion, right? Not a war against a foreign power. So these are the declared wars in American history. These are all the declared wars in American history, uh, which is usually a bit shocking to my students. So the last declared war in American history was World War II. So the U.S. hasn't declared war since World War II. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which you may agree or disagree with. But of course, after World War I, the Kellogg-Briand Agreement and other stipulations of international law actually outlawed warfare. So warfare is illegal. So if the United States declares war, it is breaking international law. So do we still fight wars since World War II? Yes, there's been obviously been some wars, but they were not officially declared wars by Congress. These are the only declared wars in history. Now uh, here's another list, and these are engagements that have been explicitly authorized by Congress. So they haven't declared war, but they've passed a resolution or some sort of legislations officially sanctioning these military engagements. And so some of them are before World War II, and you can see there are several there after World War II. Because I usually have students that say, wait a minute, the Gulf War was a declared war. And no, it was not a declared war. But Congress did authorize the use of the long-term use of the military in that situation. So these are 11 more occasions. However, there are dozens of other military actions which have been taken throughout our history, and especially since World War II, that that fall out of declared war or officially authorized by Congress. Of course, the president's the commander in chief, so he can use the military for a while. But if it needs special funding and Congress disagrees with the president, then that there becomes a problem. The Congress has also tried to curb the president's power to use military troops under the War Powers Act after the Vietnam War, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Vietnam. However, the bottom line is the president can send troops, and unless the Congress really, really, really disagrees with what the president's doing, they're probably going to fund that military action because it would be really hard to, cut our troops off from supply at that point. The other thing I think that it's important to keep in mind for all Americans uh, is that the military does not make decisions, right? The United States military um, follows the orders of the leadership of the civilians in power. Now that are elected under our government system. Now that doesn't happen everywhere in the world, but that's always what's happened in the United States. And so one of my pet peeves is when people blame the military for a war or some military action, when that's not how it works, right? The military follows orders from the civilian government. If the civilian government doesn't want the war or the military engagement, then they would not send the military there to do it. So I think that's important thing to keep in mind. It hasn't been too much of a problem lately, but especially around the Vietnam War, um, and after, there was a lot of criticism of the military itself, and of course they're following orders from the civilian leadership. They do not make national security policy. That's done at the highest levels, which is then in the hands of the civilian leadership. All right, so it's a little bit about the declaration of wars, but we go back to how are the U.S. Armed Forces led and commanded. Well, you have the president under the Constitution is the commander in chief from 1789, and this is how it looked until 1798. Of course, we discussed Congress has the power to declare war and to fund wars. The Secretary of War, I'm sorry, is one of the original cabinet members. There's not too many cabinet members under the original presidency, but there's a few, and Secretary of War is one of them. Secretary of War is over all of the services that existed at the time, which was only the Army and the Navy, with, of course, the Marines, a a uh, a an entity that was connected to the Navy. In 1798, we had some military activity going on against France at the time. Wasn't a declared war, but there's definitely some activity going on, and it was deemed that we needed to also have a Secretary of the Navy, and that was also an important part of protecting U.S. commerce, right? And so then there's a separate cabinet position created. So we now have the Secretary of War, who's over the Army, and the Secretary of Navy, who is over the Navy, and of course the Marines, who are attached to the Navy there. And that actually stays that way until 1947. So that's pretty significant, to realize this is how we were organized up through World War II. Okay, so one thing that's also I find confusing in American history, so I like to try and clarify it, um, is the National Guard, right? Because we talked a lot, when we talked about early wars, we were talking a lot about militia, right? And eventually, state militias began to be referred to as the National Guard. So, for example, we have the Idaho National Guard. Um, the Militia Act of 1903 was really important in terms of sort of modernizing that state militia system. Now, of course, state militias and then later National Guards, they their commander-in-chief is not the United States president, but instead their commander-in-chief is the governor of the state that they are in, that they're from. And so that was kind of a debate in American history of exactly how that worked. The Militia Act of 1903 solved that problem, because it officially spelled out that state National Guards, when they were requested by the President of the United States, could be federalized to augment, supplement regular military forces or regular army in wartime or for a national emergency. So at that point, so if they say, hey, so Idaho National Guard, your commander-in-chief is the governor of the state of Idaho, right? Until the president says, I need you to we need you. We're federalizing you to because of the war, and we need more troops, or because of a national emergency. Then their commander in chief becomes the president of the United States when they're federalized. What the a really important thing that this act also did was it standardized the organization, training, and protocols of each state's National Guard, because there were all different levels of training levels and equipment, and so at least there's going to be a minimum standard for National Guard units across the board after 1903. So that's going to be really helpful, of course, because we saw from some of the early wars there were some problems. There's some pros and cons of a militia system, right? One of the cons is the militia would show up and they may not be trained, they may not be disciplined, they might leave the regular forces hanging under fire sometimes, and so that helped with that as well. Now, I will mention some states today have a force separate from the state National Guard. Of course, the state National Guard is required to be federalized. Some states have what's called a state defense force. Idaho does not have one, but some states do. I believe Texas has an Army and a Navy component that's a state defense force. I also went to a conference once where I met a gentleman who was an officer in the Alabama State Defense Force. So those are a military unit that are officially sanctioned by their state, but that can't be federalized. So they only answer to the governor of that state. Now, these state defense forces, they're not well funded. They're not very big, but it is something that exists. For your information, other federal laws. There are other federal laws too, which help shape our National Guard system. But that's the root of the system there, and kind of the beginning of the modern Army National Guard units of each state. All right, so World War II, of course, the biggest war in human history. The United States has a major role. We realize that it's time for some changes. So the National Security Act of 1947 creates the Department of Defense. So you actually go back to one cabinet member, who's the Secretary of Defense, that reports directly to the president. But then you have 3 secretaries under him. The Secretary of the Army, in charge of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, in charge of the Navy Marines. And then we realize it's time for a new branch of the military, the United States Air Force. So up through World War II, the Army Air Corps was a branch of the Army, kind of like the Marines were of the Navy. Now it's going to be its own separate service with its own Secretary of the Air Force. And this is how the Department of Defense is actually still organized today, because you might wonder if they ever made one for the Marines. They have not. So the Marines don't have their own secretary and their own totally separate branch still to this point. Now, President Trump has mentioned that he wants to create a space force, and that perhaps would have its own secretary. So we'll see how that develops. The Coast Guard currently used to be under the Department of Defense, but it was transferred under the Department of Homeland Security. So we still could consider it a military unit, but its chain of command reports up through the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of Homeland Security on the presidential cabinet. All right, so here's the problem that was faced through all the wars we've talked about so far, and in World War II, and will continue to be a problem, and it is even a problem to this day. But the coordination, and it's a problem for other countries too, the coordination of the different branches and cooperation. So, I teach a lot about Pearl Harbor, and so one of the major flaws in the U.S. military system that helped lead to Pearl Harbor was the Army and the Navy not communicating with each other, or not having a single command even. So there's always that inter-service rivalry, and and then even when they do want to cooperate, it can still be a challenge. So in 1942, um, well, from 1903, there was an Army Navy board where people from the Army and the Navy were together on a board that tried to help with that cooperation. It was upgraded in 1942 as a Joint Chiefs of Staff, um, which was an ad hoc um, institution which was created in 1942. And so that was, Army and Navy generals who were on that staff who led our military forces during World War II. And so that is officially made in 1947 as part of the National Security Act. It's formalized, so there will now be a Joint Chiefs of Staff. So in theory, that that committee, if you will, is then it's the one in charge of planning and coordinating military operations where you have the Army and Navy and Air Force working together. Of course, that's which is going to happen a lot. So big milestone here. Security Act of 1947. And here's a little bit more on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in case that wasn't clear. You see who makes up the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So there's a chairman, who could be of any service. There's a vice chairman, and then there's the chief of staff of each of the military branches, including the Marine Corps has their own here, and some other people that help with the decision making, sort of a collective brain here. So that's from 1947. Now, as I said, inter-service activity is always a challenge. And in 1983, we take a military action, not on any of those lists you saw. We invaded the small island nation of Grenada to deal with some problems that were happening there. It's in Latin America, so in our sphere of influence, right? And there were exposed major problems in the command structure. The legend is, some Army private had to use a pay telephone to call in an airstrike from the Navy or something along those lines. And so that led the Joint Chiefs of Staff to be upgraded in a way. The Goldwater Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act of 1986, so a few years after that Grenada invasion. Unified combatant commands were created. So the purpose of this was to streamline operational command structure. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff will still exist, but when we're in a war, right, or have to take military action, we want one combat commander to be able to communicate and utilize all our assets: Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army, everything at his disposal all at once. And so that's what the Unified Combat Commands are created to do. And there's one in each major geographic area. And they report, they bypass all the middlemen. And of course, during a military combat operation, they report directly to the Secretary of State, who of course reports to the President. And this worked, the first major test of it was in the 1991 Gulf War. And we'll talk about the details of that later on, but it's of course where the United States went to war with Iraq to try and liberate Kuwait. And the U.S. Army commander, the Unified Combat Commander at the time, was Army General Norman Schwarzkopf, because these Unified Combat Commands can be any service. They kind of rotate, perhaps, or it depends on which geographic region it is, which it makes sense to have as the overall commander. And so he was able to use all the assets, and of course that was a model military operation that was very successful. as we liberated Kuwait and then defeated Iraq in the Gulf War. And here's the original commands, unified commands that were created. I spent a lot of time in U.S. PACOM, which is the Pacific Ocean. It's located on Oahu, Hawaii, the headquarters. And they used to kind of brag because they were in command of over 51% of the Earth's surface, because the Pacific Ocean is much bigger than people think. So a lot of that was ocean, but also Asia and Australia there you see. And that's generally a Navy command because of the ocean. But then you see the others here. So there's a Europe, there's a Middle East, there's a South America, there's a North America. This was actually updated 5 or so years ago. They added AFRICOM as its own, because Africa is a really big continent, bigger than most people think, once again. And that's one of the places where, we kind of feel like we've ignored in terms of foreign policy and compared to other parts of the world. And so it got its own unified command several years ago. And so this is what it looks like currently. And so those commanders, of course, just once again, they have overall operational command of all the services in each area. So it works much better, but still challenges when it comes to inter-service cooperation. One of the natures of military challenges. And this is just a full diagram of the Department of Defense, just for your reference.